Jolene Whitfield's shovel struck something hard on the third swing. Not a rock. Not a root. She dropped to her knees, clawed through the dirt with both hands, and pulled out a rusted metal box wrapped in yellowed plastic. Inside was a handwritten letter. She recognized the handwriting instantly, even though she hadn't seen it in 7 years. Her grandfather, the man who died when she was only 20. The letter bore her full name, a coded line, and a single sentence. "If you're reading this, the time has come." Jolene had no idea that this letter would drag her into a world of betrayal, secrets buried alongside her grandfather, and a man so powerful that no one in Detroit dared to speak his name, a man who owed her grandfather his life. But the one who had taken everything from her family was also closing in, and this time, he intended to leave no one behind. If this story touched you, please hit like and share it with the people who need to hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next stories, because sometimes the right story at the right moment can change the way you see life. But to understand why that letter changed everything, you need to know who Jolene Whitfield was before her shovel struck that box. 27 years old, a hired gardener in Detroit. Every morning, she woke while the sky was still dark, drank a cup of cold coffee left over from the night before, then climbed into the old pickup truck she had bought with money saved over 2 years. The truck was rusted along both sides. The air conditioner had been broken since last summer, but it still ran, and that was all she needed. Jolene drove through the quiet streets on the south side of the city, toward neighborhoods with white fences and soft green lawns, where she spent the entire day digging soil, planting flowers, and trimming hedges for families who had never once asked her name. She worked with her hands, with her shovel, with her back bent under the Detroit sun. At the end of the day, the homeowner handed her cash. She tucked it into the back pocket of her pants and drove home. No contract, no insurance, nothing to guarantee there would be work tomorrow. But Jolene didn't complain, because complaining required someone to listen, and she had no one. The apartment she rented was in an old building where the elevator was broken more often than it worked. She came home, locked the door, cooked dinner for one, ate standing in the kitchen because the dining table was only where she kept her gardening tools, then sat down on the floor with her back against the wall until she was tired enough to sleep. No phone ringing, no messages. Morning came again, and everything repeated itself. Exactly like yesterday, exactly like the day before, exactly like 3 years ago, exactly like every day since her grandfather was gone. Jolene had lost her family when she was small. She didn't remember much about the time before her grandfather took her in, and she didn't try to remember, because the things worth remembering only began when he was there. Franklin Whitfield raised her alone. He taught her how to plant, taught her how to fix things around the house, taught her that hands that knew how to work would never have to bow and beg from anyone. She lived with him until she was 20 years old, and then he died. Suddenly, without time to say a single word, one morning, he was still sitting on the porch drinking coffee, and by afternoon, he was lying on the kitchen floor and would never stand up again. After the funeral, Jolene stood inside the empty house and understood that from that moment on, she was completely alone in the world. No one called to offer condolences, because no one knew she existed. She locked the door of his house, walked away, and didn't come back. For 7 years, she lived that way, finding her own jobs, paying her own rent, fixing her own truck when it broke down, bandaging her own hand when the shovel cut into her skin. She didn't wait for anyone to come save her, because she had learned very early that no one ever came. Until that afternoon, when she was scrolling through her phone looking for new work, and a post appeared. A real estate company was hiring someone to clean up a yard before a house was put up for sale. The address was right there on the screen, and Jolene stopped breathing. She knew that address. She knew it by heart. It was her grandfather's house, the house she had locked up 7 years before and sworn she would never return to. But now it was about to be sold to strangers, and the thought hurt more than she expected. Jolene sat there staring at the screen for a long time. Then she pressed the call button and took the job, not because she needed the money, though she always needed money, but because she wanted to go back one last time, before the only place that had ever been home to her became someone else's house forever. The next morning, Jolene drove her pickup truck to the address she had known by heart for 20 years. The house stood there, smaller than she remembered, its gray tile roof broken in several places, weeds growing waist-high across the front yard. She turned off the engine, sat in the truck for a long while, then finally opened the door and stepped down. The manager from the real estate company had arrived before her, handed her a list of work that needed to be done, then left without asking whether she had any connection to this house. And Jolene didn't say anything either. She started in the front yard, cutting down weeds, clearing trash, trimming away dead branches that had been dry and lifeless for a long time. She worked more slowly than usual, not because she was tired, but because every footstep on this piece of land touched something she thought she had forgotten, the wooden fence her grandfather used to repair every spring, the front steps where she used to sit in the afternoon, waiting for him to finish cooking dinner, the smell of damp soil after rain, a smell she hadn't found in any other garden for the past 7 years. By early afternoon, Jolene walked around to the backyard and saw it, the oak tree. It was still standing there, much larger than the last time she had seen it, its wide canopy covering nearly half the backyard. Jolene stopped, still holding the shovel in her hand, and looked up at the trunk without moving. Her grandfather had planted this tree when she had first come to live with him. She remembered that afternoon. He dug a small hole, set the young sapling into the earth, covered it back up, then said exactly one sentence to her: "I planted this tree for you." She had been too young then to understand what he meant. Now she was 27 years old, standing alone in front of a tree that had grown taller than the roof, and she still didn't fully understand. But she knew she had to clear around the base, because the roots had lifted and cracked part of the old brick paving behind the house. She drove the shovel into the ground and began to dig. The first thrust was soft. The second was heavier because the soil had been packed tight for many years. On the third thrust, the shovel struck something hard. Jolene stopped. She had dug around this city long enough to know what buried stone in Detroit felt like under the blade of a shovel. This wasn't stone. She knelt down and dug with her hands. Soil clung beneath her fingernails, cold and damp. Her fingers touched a metal surface. She pulled up a small rusted box, wrapped in a thick layer of yellowed plastic. Someone had deliberately wrapped it carefully to keep out water. Someone had deliberately buried this box beneath the oak tree her grandfather had planted for her. Jolene sat on the ground, wiped her hands on her pants, then opened the box. Inside was a handwritten letter folded into quarters, a small brass key, and a piece of paper with an address written on it. She opened the letter and recognized the handwriting immediately, slanting to the right, every stroke dark at the beginning and fading lighter at the end, because he wrote with his left hand, her grandfather's handwriting. The letter had her name on the first line, along with a line of numbers and letters she didn't understand yet, and then the message began. He wrote that the Whitfield family had once owned many valuable properties in Detroit, that he had built that fortune over his entire life through labor and careful calculation, but he had placed his trust in the wrong person. A friend, a business partner, a man he had treated like a brother, had betrayed him, stolen all the assets through forged documents, and pushed him out with nothing left. He wrote that he couldn't fight back in the ordinary way, because the traitor had broad connections and far more power than he did. So he had done the only thing he could do. He hid the original evidence in a place only she would ever find. The key in the box opened a safe that held every legal document proving the Whitfield assets had been stolen. The line of code was the combination to open the safe. The address on the piece of paper was where the safe was being kept. And at the end of the letter, he wrote one name: Attorney Margaret Caldwell. The only person he still trusted, the person who would help her when she was ready. Jolene finished reading the letter and sat motionless in the wild, overgrown garden. She didn't stand up right away. She held the letter in both hands, looked down at that familiar, slanted handwriting, and cried. Not because of loss. She had already cried enough for loss. She cried because her grandfather had been dead for 7 years, and he was still speaking to her, still protecting her, still guiding her from beneath the roots of the tree he had planted for her on the very first day. Jolene couldn't sleep that night. She sat on the floor of her apartment, reading the letter over and over, until she knew every line by heart. The next morning, she didn't go to her gardening job. She drove straight to Detroit City Hall. She went into the public records office, filled out a request to search land records under the Whitfield name, then sat and waited. When the clerk brought out the stack of documents, Jolene turned through them page by page. What she found made her understand why her grandfather had buried that letter in the ground instead of telling her outright while he was still alive. All of the Whitfield family's commercial properties, 4 parcels of land on the south and east sides of Detroit, 2 rental buildings, an old warehouse in the industrial district, all of it had been transferred into the name of one person, Perry Stanton. The transfer papers were complete, with signatures, notarization, and seals, and they looked entirely legal. But Jolene looked at the signature at the bottom of each page, and she knew at once. Her grandfather was left-handed. He had written with his left hand his entire life, his handwriting always slanting to the right because his hand pulled across the page from left to right. The signatures on these papers slanted to the left, with the strokes heavier at the tail instead of at the beginning. They were the signatures of a right-handed person. They weren't her grandfather's. Jolene closed the stack of records, returned them to the clerk, walked out of City Hall, and sat in her pickup truck for 10 minutes without starting the engine. She took the piece of paper from the metal box and looked at the name her grandfather had written at the end of the letter. Margaret Caldwell, attorney. Along with it were a phone number and an office address. She started the truck and drove away. Maggie Caldwell's office was on the second floor of an old building downtown, the kind of building people looked at from outside and wouldn't think anyone still worked inside. Jolene knocked on the door. The woman who opened it was somewhere past 60, with silver hair pinned neatly back, her eyes sharp and quick. She looked Jolene from head to toe for exactly 2 seconds, then asked what she needed. Jolene said, "My grandfather was Franklin Whitfield. He wrote your name in the letter he left for me." Maggie didn't react right away. She didn't invite Jolene in, didn't change her expression. She asked, "Proof?" Jolene handed her the letter. Maggie read it slowly, carefully, then looked up. Anyone could find a letter. "What do you have to prove you're Franklin's granddaughter?" Jolene didn't get angry. She understood. A lawyer who had kept a secret for 7 years couldn't trust a stranger knocking on her door just because of a letter. She took out the brass key and placed it on the desk. Then she began to tell her. She told Maggie that her grandfather was left-handed, that he drank black coffee with no sugar every morning, from a white ceramic mug with a crack in the handle that he refused to replace, that he planted the oak tree in the backyard on the first day she came to live with him, that he hid emergency money in an old tea tin on top of the kitchen cabinet because he didn't fully trust banks. She told her things that weren't in any record, things no one could know unless they had lived in that house with Franklin Whitfield. Maggie listened to the end. Then she leaned back in her chair, stayed silent for a moment, and stood up. She opened the file cabinet behind her desk, took out a thick folder, and set it on the table. "I've kept this file for 7 years, she said. "I took Perry Stanton to court once. I lost because I didn't have the original evidence, only copies the court wouldn't accept." She looked at the key on the desk. "If that key opens the right safe, the one Franklin told me about before he died, then inside it is everything I've been missing for the past 7 years. Jolene looked at Maggie. "Then where do we start?" Maggie didn't answer that question right away. She looked straight at Jolene, her voice lower now. "Before we start anything, you need to understand one thing. Perry Stanton isn't an ordinary con man. He has money, political connections, his own lawyers, and people willing to do anything he asks. Franklin knew that. That's why he buried the evidence in the ground instead of taking it to the police." Jolene said nothing. She looked down at the letter in her hand, at her grandfather's familiar slanted handwriting, then folded it, slipped it into her shirt pocket, and nodded. She didn't know how large a war she was stepping into, but she knew her grandfather had been preparing her long before she knew she needed to be prepared. That same afternoon, on the other side of the city, the phone on Perry Stanton's desk began to ring. Perry answered, didn't interrupt, didn't ask the caller to repeat anything. The caller was one of the connections he had planted at City Hall years ago, the kind of person who received an envelope every month for one simple job: report back if anyone ever searched records connected to the Whitfield name. And today, for the first time in 7 years, someone had. Perry set the phone down. He said nothing for about 10 seconds, long enough for the person sitting across from him to begin feeling uncomfortable, even though Perry hadn't yet looked over. Then he spoke, his voice even and slow. "Find out who it was. Follow them. Report everything back to me." That was all. No explanation, no discussion, no need for anyone to confirm. Perry Stanton had built everything he had over the past 7 years on one foundation and one foundation only: Franklin Whitfield's assets. And he had lived long enough in this world to know that when a dead name suddenly came back to life in public records, someone was digging up a grave. Perry wasn't afraid of gravediggers, but he never allowed anyone to finish digging. Jolene knew nothing about that phone call. She left Maggie Caldwell's office with her head heavy with information, driving home as the sky began to darken. She was thinking about the key, about the safe, about the address written on the paper, about everything she needed to do next. She parked in front of her apartment building, climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, then stopped in front of her apartment door. The door had been forced open. The lock was still intact, but the frame was cracked along the lower edge, enough for someone to shove the door open without a key. Jolene stood in the hallway for 3 seconds, then pushed the door and stepped inside. The apartment had been searched from top to bottom. Not in a destructive way, but in a systematic way. Someone had opened every drawer, turned over every bag, checked every corner, but they hadn't taken anything, because Jolene had nothing worth taking. No jewelry, no cash hidden in the apartment, no laptop or any device of value. This wasn't a robbery. This was a message. Someone wanted her to know that they knew who she was, knew where she lived, and could enter her home whenever they wanted. Jolene stood in the middle of the ransacked apartment, and she wasn't afraid. She was angry. Angry in the way only people who have already lost everything can be angry. The way a person feels when there's nothing left to take, so there's nothing left to threaten. She drew in a long breath, then she acted. She took out her grandfather's letter, the key, and the paper with the address, carried them all to a copy shop 2 blocks from her apartment, and made 2 copies of each. She placed the originals in an envelope, which she would take to Maggie Caldwell tomorrow. 1 copy she folded small, sealed inside a waterproof plastic bag, then carried out to her pickup truck. She opened the gardening toolbox in the back of the truck, the large metal box that held shovels, pruning shears, gloves, and bags of soil. She placed the plastic bag with the copies at the bottom of the box, covered it with tools, then closed the lid. No one looked for legal documents beneath a pile of dirty shovels and soil in a gardener's truck. That night, Jolene didn't sleep in her apartment. She locked the door, even though she knew the lock no longer meant anything. Then went down to her pickup truck, reclined the seat, and slept in the vehicle, just as she had done many times before when life hadn't given her any better choice. She lay in the dark, eyes open, staring up at the old truck ceiling, and she understood one thing clearly. Someone had started paying attention to her, and if they were willing to search her home just because she had looked up one name in public records, then whatever her grandfather had buried beneath the oak tree was far more dangerous than she had imagined. At the same time, Jolene lay in her pickup truck, staring up at the ceiling in the dark, on the north side of Detroit. On the highest floor of a commercial building with no nameplate in the lobby, a meeting was taking place behind closed doors. Warren Gallagher sat at the head of the long table, listening as 4 men took turns reporting on the week's business operations. He didn't take notes, didn't interrupt, didn't nod. When the last man finished speaking, Warren said 2 sentences. Those 2 sentences decided who got to keep which territory, who had to give up what, and the meeting was over. No one objected. Not because they were afraid Warren would lose his temper, but because in the past 13 years, Warren hadn't made a wrong decision once. And in that world, a man who wasn't wrong didn't need to explain himself. The 4 men stood and left the room. Only one person stayed behind, Garrett Nash, Warren's second in command, the man who had been with him for 12 years, from the days when the 2 of them had nothing but an old car and a list of people who owed money. Garrett closed the conference room door, waited until the footsteps outside the hallway had faded completely, then spoke. Someone searched land records under the Whitfield name at City Hall this morning. Warren was straightening the file on the table. His hand stopped. Not suddenly, not with a start. It simply stopped, as though that name was heavy enough to make everything else no longer matter. Whitfield. He hadn't heard that name in 7 years, but he had never forgotten it. 13 years ago, Warren was 20 years old, just a low-level enforcer in the organization, with no power, no voice, only blind loyalty to people he had believed were worthy of trust. Then the coup happened. Factions inside the organization turned against one another, and Warren was trapped on the losing side. Everyone ran. Everyone turned their backs. Everyone chose the winning side so they could survive. Only one man stayed. Franklin Whitfield, the organization's financial advisor, an old man who never carried a weapon, only ledgers and calculators, hid Warren in the basement of his office for 3 days, until everything went quiet, then led him out through a back exit no one knew about. Warren remembered Franklin's face on that final night before they parted. The old man stood at the rear door, looked at him, and said exactly one sentence. "When my granddaughter needs help, you'll know what to do." Warren had nodded then, without fully understanding the weight of the promise he had just made. He was 20 years old, newly escaped from death, thinking about surviving the next day, not about a granddaughter he had never met. But in the years that followed, as Warren climbed rung after rung, as he became the head of the Gallagher organization, as he gained enough power that no one in Detroit dared say his name without thinking carefully first, he never forgot that sentence. Because Franklin Whitfield was the only person in his life who had looked at a 20-year-old kid with nothing and chosen to stay and save him, not for profit, not for faction, but because he believed that kid deserved to live. With a man like that, a promise carried more weight than any contract Warren had ever signed. Warren looked at Garrett. "Who searched the records?" Garrett shook his head. "Not clear yet. All we know is that today, the Whitfield land records were searched for the first time in 7 years. Warren stood, walked to the conference room door, opened it, and called one name: Bert. Bert Harlan appeared within 10 seconds. He was entirely different from Garrett, so quiet that many people in the organization weren't sure he knew how to say a sentence longer than 5 words. But when Warren needed something done precisely, with no questions, no mistakes, Bert was the only man he called. "Find out who's searching the Whitfield land records," Warren said. "Find out who that person is, where they are, and what they're looking for. Report back to me before doing anything else." Bert nodded once, then disappeared from the doorway. Warren stood alone in the empty conference room. 7 years. He had been waiting for the Whitfield name to surface again for 7 years, because he knew Franklin wasn't the kind of man who left this world with nothing behind. That old man calculated everything. Always. Every number. Every step. If someone was digging through the Whitfield records again, then either it was an enemy trying to erase tracks, or it was the person Franklin had prepared for in advance. Either way, Warren needed to know, because his promise had no expiration date. Bert Harlan found Jolene in less than 2 days. It wasn't hard. She was the only person who had searched the Whitfield records in 7 years. She had used her real name, and the address of her rented apartment was right there in the registration file for the records request. That evening, Bert stood in front of Jolene's 3rd-floor apartment door and knocked. Jolene opened the door and saw a man she didn't know. Tall, solid, his face without expression, standing exactly 1 step away from the door. She hadn't had time to say anything before Bert spoke first. "I was sent to keep you safe." Jolene looked at him for 3 seconds, then shut the door. She didn't ask anything else, didn't need an explanation, didn't want to listen. She had lived alone long enough to know that when a stranger stood outside your door at night and said he wanted to protect you, 9 times out of 10, it wasn't a good thing. She locked the door, dragged a chair over to block it from the inside, then sat down on the floor and listened. Bert didn't knock a second time. He didn't call her name. He didn't explain. He stood outside in the hallway all night. Jolene knew because she didn't sleep. A few times, she pressed her ear to the door and heard the steady breathing on the other side, the faint shift of shoes against the floor whenever the man changed the leg he was standing on. He didn't leave. The next morning, when Jolene opened the door to go to work, Bert was still standing in the exact same place. His clothes were more wrinkled. His eyes were still alert, not tired, or very good at hiding it. Jolene stopped in the doorway and looked at him. "Who sent you?" Bert looked at her, his voice even and brief. "Someone who owed your grandfather." Jolene went silent. She had read enough of her grandfather's letter to know that Franklin once had connections she had never been told about. She looked at Bert for a few more seconds, judging him. He had stood outside her door all night without knocking a second time, without leaving, without forcing his way in. She didn't trust him, but she was curious enough to want to know who stood behind him. "Take me to meet that person," Jolene said. "I'll meet him and listen. I'm not promising anything." Bert nodded, then stepped ahead to lead the way. 40 minutes later, Jolene was standing inside the elevator of a North Detroit building whose name she had never heard. Bert pressed the button for the highest floor. The elevator doors opened into a quiet hallway, and at the end of it was a closed wooden door. Bert knocked twice, then opened the door and stepped aside. Jolene walked in. The room was spacious, with a large desk and glass windows overlooking the city. Warren Gallagher sat behind the desk, watching her enter. He didn't stand, didn't shake her hand, didn't smile. He looked at her with the calm eyes of a man used to measuring people in the first few seconds. On the desk were 2 cups of coffee, 1 cup in front of Warren, 1 in front of the chair opposite him. Jolene pulled the chair out, sat down, and didn't touch the coffee. The two of them looked at each other in silence for a few seconds. Then Warren spoke. Your grandfather once saved my life. I promised him that when you needed help, I would be there. You need help now, and I'm here." His voice was low, even, without emphasis, without any attempt to make an impression. He said it as if he were reporting a simple fact. Jolene listened and didn't react right away. She looked at Warren, looked at the room, looked at the glass behind him, with the entire Detroit skyline spread out below. She understood what kind of man she was sitting across from. She didn't know his name, but she knew this type of man. Powerful, dangerous, and telling her that he wanted to protect her. She looked straight into Warren's eyes. "I've lived 27 years without needing anyone to protect me. I earn my own money. I sleep in my truck when I don't have a home. I bandage my own hand when I'm hurt. I don't know who you are, and I don't want to owe a man like you anything." She pushed the chair back, stood up, and walked toward the door. Before she left, she turned and looked at Warren one more time. "Thanks for the coffee I didn't drink." Then she walked out. Warren sat still, watching the door close. He wasn't angry. He wasn't surprised. He was used to people bowing their heads to him, agreeing with him, obeying him. But the girl who had just walked out of the room was the first person in a very long time to look him straight in the face and say no. And the way she said no, the way she sat before him without fear, the way she refused and walked away without looking back. It was exactly like someone Warren had known 13 years ago. Franklin Whitfield, the same eyes, the same kind of person. Bert stepped into the room, waiting for orders. Warren looked at him. "Follow her. Don't let her know." Perry Stanton wasn't the kind of man who sat still and waited. When his people reported back that Warren Gallagher had sent Bert Harlan to look into the Whitfield records, Perry understood immediately that the game had become more complicated than a girl digging in the dirt and finding old papers. Warren Gallagher getting involved meant the Whitfield name was no longer just the past. It was becoming a present problem. And Perry Stanton handled present problems by meeting them face to face. He called Warren that morning, his voice soft and polite, inviting Warren to lunch at a high-end restaurant downtown so they could talk business, man to man. Warren accepted, not because he cared about Perry's invitation, but because Warren wanted to look into the eyes of the man who had betrayed Franklin Whitfield. When Warren arrived at the restaurant, Perry was already seated at the table farthest inside. Around the table, scattered across 3 nearby tables, were Perry's men. No one wore anything unusual. No one looked toward the main table, but Warren recognized them the moment he walked in. He had lived in this world long enough to know when a restaurant was full of ordinary customers and when it was full of arranged bodies. Warren came alone. No Bert. No one following behind him. He pulled out the chair and sat across from Perry, ordered black coffee, then leaned back and waited. Perry watched Warren from the moment he came through the door until the moment he sat down. He had heard about Warren Gallagher for years, had seen that name appear more and more often in conversations ordinary people never got to hear. But this was the first time the two men had sat across from each other. Perry opened with a few polite remarks about the Detroit real estate market, about the rising value of land on the south side, about possible opportunities for cooperation between the two sides. Warren listened, didn't interrupt, didn't react, and drank his coffee in small sips while Perry talked. Then Perry came to the point. He leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly, just enough to make the conversation feel more private. "I hear you've taken an interest in a few old records, things from a long time ago, things that don't concern anyone anymore." Perry paused for a beat, then continued. "I have 2 parcels of land on the north side. Good location, clean paperwork. I'm willing to transfer them to you at a reasonable price, as a gesture of goodwill between us. In return, you don't need to waste your time on old matters that don't belong to you." Warren set his coffee cup down. He looked at Perry for the first time since sitting down, straight at him, without blinking, without hurry. Then he drank the rest of the coffee in his cup, placed it gently back on the saucer, and spoke. "Franklin once taught me something. Never accept anything from the hand of a man who isn't worthy." Warren stood. He didn't say another word. No explanation, no threat, no counteroffer. He straightened the collar of his jacket, turned his back, and walked out of the restaurant. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Perry sat at the table, watching Warren's figure disappear beyond the glass door. He didn't move for about half a minute. The men seated at the surrounding tables glanced at one another, but no one dared say anything, because Perry was silent. And when Perry Stanton was silent, it wasn't the moment for anyone else to open their mouth. Perry had lived 55 years on two things: money and the ability to turn people into allies or turn them into nobody. He bought police officers, bought politicians, bought lawyers, bought witnesses. Everyone had a price, and Perry always had enough money to pay it. But the man who had just stood up and walked away without looking back, that man had no price. Perry understood that the moment Warren mentioned Franklin's name, this wasn't about money, this was about a promise. And a man who kept a promise out of loyalty rather than profit was the most dangerous kind of man Perry had ever met. Because there was nothing to buy, nothing to threaten, no button to press. Perry took out his phone, dialed a number, and waited through 2 rings. Find Jolene Whitfield. I need to know where she is, what she's doing, and who she's talking to. Starting today. He hung up, set the phone down on the table, and sat staring at the empty coffee cup Warren had left behind. The polite conversation was over. From that moment on, Perry Stanton was no longer probing. He was moving to attack. Perry didn't take long. Just 2 days after the lunch at the restaurant, his men found Jolene. That afternoon, Jolene was kneeling beside a bed of soil in the backyard of a suburban mansion, both hands covered in mud, replanting a row of shrubs along the fence for a client. She heard footsteps on the gravel behind her and turned around. 2 men stood about 3 steps away from her, empty-handed, their faces calm. But the way they stood blocking the only path out to the gate told Jolene at once that these weren't passers-by. The man in front spoke, his voice light, not openly threatening, but every word was clear. Miss Whitfield, we're here on behalf of Mr. Perry Stanton. He suggests that you sign a document giving up all rights related to the assets under the Whitfield name. This is a polite offer. Last time, we only stopped by your apartment as a reminder. If you don't cooperate, next time won't just be a reminder. The second man said nothing. He only stood there watching her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. Jolene knelt on the ground, her right hand still holding the shovel, looking at the 2 men in front of her. She didn't stand up. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew standing up right now was the reaction they wanted to see, a sign that she was worried, panicking, considering their words. She didn't give them that. She looked at the man who had spoken and kept her voice normal, as if she were talking to a customer asking about the price of planting shrubs. I heard you. Now go. The 2 men looked at her for a few more seconds, then turned and walked away. No more words. The message had been delivered. Jolene sat still on the ground until the sound of their car left the street. Then she drove the shovel into the soil, rested her forehead against the handle, and breathed slowly. Her hands were trembling a little, not from fear, but because anger held down too long had begun to escape through her fingers. That evening, Jolene returned to her apartment, locked the door, and sat on the floor. She looked at the phone in her hand and thought. She had lived alone long enough to know how strong she was. She knew she could endure, could take care of herself, could sleep in her pickup truck in the middle of a Detroit winter without complaining to anyone. But she was also smart enough to understand that one person's endurance wasn't enough to stand against a system. Perry Stanton had money, lawyers, and people willing to come all the way to her workplace to pressure her into signing papers. She had only her hands, her pickup truck, and a gardening toolbox with copies of legal documents hidden at the bottom. Alone, she could survive, but alone, she couldn't win. Jolene opened her phone and found Bert Harlan's number. He had left it with her before she walked out of Warren's office the last time, and she remembered stuffing the slip of paper into her pants pocket without thinking she would ever use it. She called. Bert answered after the first ring. Take me to see Warren. Tonight. Bert didn't ask why. I'll pick you up in 20 minutes. 20 minutes later, Jolene was sitting in Bert's car. 40 minutes after that, she stood before the familiar wooden door on the highest floor of the North Side building. This time, she didn't wait for Bert to open the door. She pushed it open herself and walked in. Warren was sitting in the same place, behind the desk. He watched her enter and said nothing, waiting for her to speak first. The last time she had come here, it had been out of curiosity. This time, she had come because she had made a decision. I'm not going to dance around this, Jolene said, her voice completely different from the first time they met. Still straight, still clear, but no longer the voice of someone refusing. It was the voice of someone who had finished calculating. Perry Stanton is pressuring me to sign away my grandfather's assets. I won't sign. But I'm also not strong enough to fight him alone. I have evidence proving that the Whitfield assets were taken illegally. You have the power to protect the legal process until that evidence reaches the court. I'm not asking for a favor. I'm offering a fair exchange. You want Perry Stanton to fall, and I have what can pull him down." Warren listened, then went silent. He looked at Jolene, and this time, he no longer saw Franklin's granddaughter in need of protection. He saw a woman who knew what she had, knew what she lacked, and knew how to frame the matter so the person sitting across from her couldn't refuse without losing more than he gained. He saw a partner. Warren nodded once. "Sit down. We begin." From that night on, everything began to move. Jolene took the brass key and the address on the piece of paper to Maggie Caldwell. Maggie and Bert went with her to the basement of an old industrial building on the outskirts of Detroit, exactly the address her grandfather had written down. The safe sat in the farthest corner, covered in dust, untouched for 7 years. Jolene turned the combination, inserted the key, and opened the lid. Inside was everything Maggie had been missing for the past 7 years. The original contracts with Franklin's real signature, the property ownership papers from before the transfers, copies of the notarized records Perry didn't know Franklin had kept, and a thick file documenting in detail every transaction Perry had carried out to move the Whitfield assets into his own name. Maggie held the file with both hands, turned through a few pages, then looked at Jolene. "It's enough. Enough to reopen the case, and this time, we won't lose." From that day forward, the three of them worked together. Jolene provided the evidence and signed the necessary authorization papers as the legal heir. Maggie assembled the legal file, checked every document against the others, and prepared for a lawsuit she had waited 7 years to fight again. Warren provided the one thing these two women didn't have: protection. He didn't interfere with the legal process, didn't read the files, didn't ask Maggie what step she was on. He only made sure no one could touch Jolene or Maggie while they prepared. The first thing Warren did was move Jolene out of her old apartment. That place had been exposed, the lock had been forced, and Perry knew the address. Bert took Jolene to a small apartment on the 4th floor of a building, in a quiet neighborhood on the west side of the city, the kind of neighborhood where neighbors didn't ask each other's names, and no one paid attention to unfamiliar cars. Jolene stepped into the new apartment, set her bag down on the floor, and realized something. The electrical system worked perfectly. Hot water ran the moment she turned the faucet. The gas stove was new, the refrigerator was clean. This apartment hadn't just been rented. It had been repaired before she arrived. She looked at Bert standing in the doorway. "Who fixed this place?" Bert looked at her, his face unchanged. "Boss doesn't explain." Jolene didn't ask anything else. She turned back to look at the apartment, at the steady light glowing from the ceiling, at the faucet running hot water without making her wait 10 minutes for it to warm. She didn't say thank you, because she wasn't ready to say that to someone she still didn't fully understand. But that night, as she stood in the kitchen cooking her first dinner in a home where everything worked, she wondered when the last time was that she had stood inside a room someone had prepared for her. The answer was 7 years ago, when her grandfather was still alive. One evening, when Jolene came to Warren's office to sign more paperwork for Maggie, she stayed seated after the work was done. Warren was reviewing another file on the desk, unrelated to the Whitfield case, his work, the kind of thing Jolene didn't ask about and didn't want to know. But there was a question that had been sitting in her mind since the first time she met him. "Why?" she asked. Warren looked up. "Why do you keep a promise to someone who's been gone for 7 years? My grandfather isn't here anymore. He doesn't know what you're doing. No one is checking. No one is demanding anything. You could forget it, and no one would blame you for anything." Warren set the file down. He looked at Jolene and stayed silent for a while, not because he needed to think of an answer, but because he was deciding whether to tell the truth. Then he said, "Because he was the only person who saved me when I was nothing. A promise to a man like that doesn't have an expiration date." He didn't say more, didn't explain, didn't tell the story from 13 years ago, just one sentence. And then he picked up the file again and continued working as if the conversation had ended. Jolene sat there for a little longer, looking at the man across from her. Then she stood, went back to her new apartment, locked the door, and for the first time in 7 years, she slept without having to drag a chair against the door. Perry Stanton didn't wait for the court. He attacked first. Within the same week, 2 business locations belonging to the Gallagher organization were hit. A warehouse on the east side and a front business downtown, both smashed apart during the night without leaving behind a single trace that could lead back to Perry. At the same time, Police began showing up at places connected to Warren, checking licenses, inspecting security, asking questions ordinary officers never asked unless someone higher up had told them to ask. Warren sat in the conference room, listening as Bert reported the damage, and he didn't care about the damage. 2 destroyed locations could be rebuilt. Police harassment could be handled with lawyers. What made Warren stop was another detail. The East Side warehouse had been moved into less than 3 weeks earlier. Only people inside the organization knew the location. The downtown front business had changed its guard schedule 4 days before, and whoever broke in had chosen the only empty shift that week. This wasn't Perry making a guess. This was Perry knowing exactly. And if Perry knew exactly, then someone inside the house was talking to Perry. Warren looked at Bert. Find out who. It took Bert 3 days. He didn't question many people, didn't draw attention, only quietly checked every detail, every call, every entry and exit made by those who had access to internal information. By the 3rd day, he placed a phone on Warren's desk. On the screen was the call history between a number inside the organization and a number belonging to Perry Stanton's office. The number inside the organization belonged to Garrett Nash. Warren looked at the phone screen for a long time. He said nothing, didn't slam his fist on the table, didn't curse. Bert stood across from him, silent, waiting. He had worked with Warren long enough to know that when Warren stayed silent that long, that was when everything was heaviest. Warren said, his voice even, "Call Garrett up here." 15 minutes later, Garrett Nash walked into the conference room. He looked at Warren sitting at the head of the table, looked at Bert standing beside the door, and he knew. No one had to say a word. Garrett looked at the phone on the table, looked at Warren's face, and he knew. Bert stepped outside and closed the door. Only 2 men remained in the room, Warren and Garrett. 12 years. 12 years of Garrett walking beside Warren from the days when neither of them had anything. From the days they shared a single meal. From the nights they took turns staying awake to keep watch because there weren't enough men. From the time Warren was only a low-level enforcer trying to survive the next day, and Garrett was the only person standing beside him. 12 years of building. 12 years of trust. 12 years of Warren giving Garrett things he gave no one else, because he believed Garrett was the one man who would never turn his back. Warren looked at Garrett and asked only one question. How long? Garrett stood in the middle of the room without sitting down. He was silent for 10 seconds, then answered, 6 months. What did Perry promise you? Control of the East Side, and the top position when you're no longer here. Warren didn't react. He sat still, both hands resting on the table, looking at the man he had trusted for 12 years as he stood before him and admitted he had sold him to the enemy for the price of a promise of power. Garrett continued, his voice without apology, without excuse, simply speaking the truth like a man who had carried it too long. You trusted me, I know, but you never let me stand beside you as an equal. 12 years, I stood behind you. 12 years, I was the second man, and not once did you ask if I wanted more than that. I'm tired, Warren. The room went silent. Warren looked at Garrett, and there was no anger in his eyes. There was something heavier than anger, something like disappointment settled into calm, because it had gone too deep to burn anymore. Warren spoke slowly. I trusted you, Garrett. That was what I gave you. Bigger than territory, bigger than position, bigger than anything Perry Stanton could ever promise. But you didn't understand that, and that isn't my fault. Warren stood, walked to the door, and opened it. Light from the hallway spilled in. Garrett understood. He walked out of the room, down the hallway, past the people standing outside. No one said anything to him. No one looked at him. Garrett Nash stepped into the elevator and disappeared from the building, from the organization, from the world he had belonged to for 12 years, not by a punch or a threat, but by the complete silence of the people who had once called him brother. Warren closed the conference room door, turned off the lights, and sat back down in his old chair. 12 years. He sat alone in the dark room and said nothing to anyone. Bert called Jolene late that night. He didn't give details, only said 4 words. Garrett betrayed the boss. Then he hung up. Jolene sat on the bed in the temporary apartment, looking at the dark phone screen, and she didn't need anyone to explain more. She knew who Garrett was. She had seen the way Warren mentioned Garrett in the brief meetings she had happened to witness, not as an order, but with trust, the kind people only give to someone who has walked beside them for too long. And now that person had crossed to the other side. Jolene got up, put on her coat, and left the apartment. She didn't call ahead, didn't send a message. She drove her pickup truck to the north side building, nodded to the guard in the lobby who now recognized her, and stepped into the elevator to the highest floor. The hallway was empty. No one was there. The people in the organization had all gone home after Garrett walked out. No one wanted to stay near Warren on a night like this, because no one knew what to say. And saying the wrong thing at a moment like this might be the last sentence they were ever allowed to speak inside the organization. Jolene walked to the end of the hallway. The conference room door was closed, with no light slipping through the crack beneath it. She didn't knock. She pushed gently. The door wasn't locked, and she stepped inside. The room was dark. Warren sat at the head of the table, in the same old place, the same old chair, the same old posture. But unlike every other time Jolene had seen him, this time he wasn't doing anything. No files on the table, no phone, no coffee, just sitting. Jolene didn't turn on the light. She pulled a chair from the opposite side of the table, set it down a few steps away from Warren, and sat. She didn't say, "I heard what happened," because Warren knew she had heard. Bert had called her. She didn't say, "I'm sorry," because an apology is what people say when they don't know what else to say. And Jolene wasn't the kind of person who spoke just to fill the air. She didn't say, "I understand how you feel," because no one truly understands what another person feels when the one they trusted most sells them out, unless they have been there themselves. She only sat, silent, in the dark, across from Warren. 1 minute passed, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. The room was so quiet they could hear the steady hum of the air conditioner somewhere above the ceiling. Warren didn't look at her, or maybe he did, but in the dark, no one could tell. He didn't ask why she had come, didn't ask what she needed, because he understood that Jolene hadn't come because she needed anything. She didn't need him to sign papers, didn't need to discuss strategy, didn't need anything he could order someone else to prepare. She had come because she chose to come, and on the night when everyone had left the building, when everyone had avoided this room, when everyone had left Warren alone with what 12 years of loyalty had just become, Jolene was the only one who walked in the opposite direction. Not out of duty, not because of a contract, not because of the debt between Warren and her grandfather, but because she knew what it felt like to sit alone after the person you trusted most had walked away. She had sat like that for 7 years. 10 minutes passed, maybe longer. Then Jolene stood, pushed the chair back against the table, and walked toward the door. She placed her hand on the doorknob, then stopped. She didn't turn around, but her voice was clear in the dark room. My grandfather was betrayed by the person he trusted most too, but he still chose to trust one more person. That person was you, and he wasn't wrong. She opened the door, stepped out, and closed it behind her. Her footsteps faded down the hallway, then disappeared completely. Warren sat in the dark room for a long while after that, but the darkness in the room was lighter than it had been before she came. Garrett Nash had leaked the location of Jolene's temporary apartment to Perry before he was discovered. That information was buried in the final calls between Garrett and Perry's office, and when Bert went back through Garrett's communication history, he found a message clearly listing the address in the West Side neighborhood, along with Jolene's daily movement schedule. Perry had everything he needed before Garrett stepped into the elevator and left the Gallagher organization for the last time. 2 days after the night Jolene sat with Warren in the dark conference room, she drove her pickup truck to work in the morning as she did every day. She had just turned onto an empty street 4 blocks from the temporary apartment when a black car blocked the road in front of her, and another pressed in close behind. Before she could react, the car doors opened. 2 men pulled her out of the pickup, put her into the rear car, and all 3 vehicles left the street in less than a minute. No one on the street saw anything, or if they did, no one wanted to see it. When Jolene opened her eyes, she was sitting on a wooden chair inside a large, empty warehouse, with dim light from a few industrial bulbs overhead falling down around her. Her hands were tied behind the chair. In front of her stood a small table. On the table were a white sheet of paper and a pen. Beside the table, mounted on a tripod, was a camera with its red light already on. Jolene looked around. 2 men stood behind her. Another stood by the entrance. And on the other side of the table, Perry Stanton entered the warehouse, buttoning his suit jacket, walking slowly toward her as if he were stepping into an ordinary business meeting on a Monday morning. Perry pulled out a chair, sat down across from Jolene, looked at her for a long while, then said, "It's very simple, Miss Whitfield. You read the paper in front of the camera. You say you're voluntarily giving up all rights related to the Whitfield assets. You sign your name. Then you go home, and we never see each other again. Perry pushed the paper and the pen toward Jolene. I don't need your signature to win in court. My lawyers are 10 times better than old Caldwell. But I like things clean. A video of you voluntarily saying it in front of the camera will make everything faster. Jolene looked at the paper, looked at the camera, then looked back at Perry. She didn't say no. She didn't refuse right away. Instead, she asked, How long did you know my grandfather? Perry tilted his head slightly, not expecting the question, but he was a man who liked talking about himself, especially when he believed he was winning. 20 years. Franklin and I started together when we had nothing. I was the one who brought him into the Detroit real estate market. Then why did you take everything from him? Perry smiled faintly. I didn't take it. I built it. Franklin was good with numbers, but he didn't understand scale. He wanted to keep everything small, safe, controllable. I was the one who saw the real potential and turned it into an empire. What I have today is what I built, not what I took. Jolene listened and didn't interrupt. She let Perry talk because every minute he talked was another minute she remained sitting there, another minute that shortened the distance between the moment she vanished from the street and the moment Bert realized she had gone silent. She didn't know whether Warren was already looking for her. She only knew that she needed time, and Perry was the kind of man who gave her time for free whenever he got to talk about himself. Perry went on about the early years, about the deals, about the way he had expanded the Whitfield empire into the Stanton empire. He spoke with the pride of a man who believed he deserved everything he had, even when the way he got it was by betraying the person who had trusted him most. Then Jolene spoke. Her voice was calm, not raised, not trembling. Each word clear, as if she were reading from a report. The night you forged my grandfather's signature, you did it in the private office on the 3rd floor, after 10 o'clock at night. You used your right hand to sign 4 sets of transfer documents. There was a man standing outside the door keeping watch for you. His name was Dwight Pryor, and you paid him in cash, and with a small piece of land on the south side to keep him quiet. Perry didn't move. His entire body went rigid in the chair, as if someone had pulled all the air out of the room. Jolene continued. My grandfather knew everything. He knew from that night on. He didn't say anything because he knew he didn't have enough power to fight you at the time, but he wrote it all down, every detail, every name, every number, and he didn't write it only for me. Jolene looked straight into Perry's eyes, her back straight in the chair even though her hands were tied behind her. My grandfather knew everything, and he wrote everything down. The original documents are in a place you'll never find. Copies are already in the lawyer's hands, and you thought I only had one copy here, on me, so you could take it and end this? Perry shot up from his chair. For the first time since he had walked into the warehouse, the calm, confident, controlled mask on his face cracked apart. He looked at Jolene as if he were looking at someone he had completely underestimated from the beginning. The 27-year-old gardener sat tied to a chair in his warehouse, and she had just spoken aloud the things he had believed were buried with Franklin Whitfield 7 years ago. Jolene looked at Perry standing there, losing control in front of her for the first time and the last, and she said nothing more. She had said enough. The rest was no longer hers to do. Bert called Jolene at 7 o'clock in the morning, the way he did every day, to confirm she had left the apartment safely. No one answered. He called a second time, a third, a fourth. The phone rang long enough, then went to voicemail. Bert didn't call a fifth time. He drove to Jolene's temporary apartment in 15 minutes. The door was locked. Everything inside was untouched, but Jolene's pickup truck wasn't in the parking lot. Bert drove along the route Jolene usually took to work every morning. 4 blocks from the apartment, he found the pickup pulled crooked against the curb, the driver's door open, the key still in the ignition, her gardening tool bag still lying on the passenger seat. Bert called Warren. Jolene is out of contact. Her truck was left on the road. Door open. No sign she left by herself. Warren listened, then stayed silent for exactly 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds were all the time he needed to understand what had happened. Garrett had leaked the location before he was removed. Perry had acted. And Jolene was somewhere in this city, in the hands of the man who had betrayed her grandfather. Warren didn't call the police, because there were people on Perry's payroll inside the Detroit police. He didn't wait for more information, because every minute of waiting was another minute Perry had to work with. He mobilized every resource that 13 years of building the organization had given him. Bert contacted the street network, the vendors, the taxi drivers, the corner store owners, the eyes the police didn't have but the Gallagher organization had everywhere. At the same time, one of Warren's people pulled security footage along the route where the pickup had been abandoned. Within 2 hours, they had the images. 3 cars, 2 blocking front and rear, 1 taking the person, all headed toward the industrial district on the south side. From there, the street sources narrowed the area. An old warehouse at the far end of the industrial district, owned by a shell company registered under the name of one of Perry's business partners. Bert drove ahead to scout the place. 10 minutes later, he called back. Cars outside, men guarding the door. The right place. Warren didn't say much. He said, "Gather everyone. I'm going first." Bert went silent for a beat, then said, "Boss, let me go in first." "No, I'm going first." Bert didn't ask a second time because he understood. This wasn't about tactics. This was about a promise. Warren arrived at the warehouse with 8 men from the organization. He stepped out of the car first and walked straight to the main door of the warehouse, not stopping, not waiting for anyone to take position. The man guarding the door saw Warren coming and recognized at once who he was. He stepped aside without needing to be asked. Warren's men subdued the 3 others inside quickly, cleanly, without noise, without dragging it out. Warren walked through the warehouse door and saw Jolene. She was sitting on a wooden chair, her hands tied behind her. There was a light bruise on her left cheekbone, but her eyes were bright, awake, and when she saw Warren walk in, she didn't cry, didn't call his name, didn't let out a breath of relief. She only looked at him, and in that look was something Warren recognized immediately. She had known he would come. Perry Stanton stood beside the table, watching Warren step through the door. He said nothing. He didn't need to, because both men knew that the moment Warren Gallagher set foot inside this warehouse, all of Perry's calculations had ended. Warren walked straight to Jolene. He untied her, not hurriedly, but not slowly either. He didn't ask whether she was all right, because that question was unnecessary for someone who had just sat tied to a chair facing her enemy and still hadn't broken. He took off his coat, placed it over her shoulders, then stepped back. Jolene stood on her own. She didn't need anyone to support her. She walked out of the warehouse herself, climbed into the car herself, sat in the passenger seat herself, and closed the door. Warren got into the driver's seat. He started the engine and drove out of the industrial district. He said nothing. Jolene sat beside him, Warren's coat still over her shoulders, looking through the windshield. Both of them stayed silent for the first 10 minutes. The road carried them past dark rows of buildings, through empty intersections, past houses where the streetlights glowed faintly. Then Jolene spoke, her voice soft, without looking over at Warren. "My grandfather chose the right man." Warren didn't answer. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, not because he was angry, but because in all the 13 years he had kept his promise to Franklin Whitfield, this was the first time anyone had said a sentence that made him feel worthy of the trust that old man had placed in him. He said nothing. He simply drove her back to safety, because that was what he had promised. That night, Jolene didn't sleep. She sat on the bed in the temporary apartment, Warren's coat still draped over her shoulders, and took out her grandfather's letter. The letter was far more wrinkled now than it had been the first time she opened it beneath the oak tree. The folds had softened because she had opened and closed it so many times. The ink in a few places had blurred because her fingers had touched it too often. She had read this letter dozens of times, but every time she read it, she stopped in the middle, at the part where he wrote about Perry's betrayal, about the stolen assets, about the key and the safe. She stopped there because that was the part she needed in order to act, the part that gave her direction, the part that answered the question of what to do next. But tonight, for the first time, Jolene read all the way to the end. The final part of the letter was on the back of the paper, the handwriting smaller, the strokes more unsteady, as if her grandfather had written this part at another time, maybe later, maybe when he already knew he didn't have much time left. He wrote that he knew he wouldn't live long enough to watch her grow up, to protect her when she needed him, to sit beside her and explain everything he had hidden and why. He wrote that he had prepared everything he could. The documents sent to the lawyer, the evidence buried beneath the tree only the 2 of them knew about, and one person. He wrote, "There's a man I saved many years ago. That man owes me his life, but I didn't bind him with that debt. I believe he'll keep his word because his nature is better than the world he's living in. When you meet him, you'll understand why I chose to trust him. Not because I had no one else, but because he's worthy. Jolene set the letter down. She sat still for a long time, staring at the slanted handwriting at the bottom of the page, the strokes trembling but still clear, still dark at the beginning and fading at the end, because he had written with his left hand. Her grandfather had known he was going to leave, and before he left, he had arranged everything, not only the evidence and the documents, but also the person who would stand beside her when she needed it most. The next morning, Jolene went to Warren's office. She didn't make an appointment. She walked straight into the room, placed the letter on the desk in front of him, and said, "Read the last part, the back." Warren looked at her, then looked down at the letter. He picked it up, turned it over, and read. The room fell silent. Jolene stood beside the window, not looking at Warren, giving him space to read what Franklin had written about him without anyone watching. Warren read slowly. Jolene knew he was reading slowly, because she could count nearly a full minute passing without him turning the page, without setting the letter down, without moving. Then he placed the letter on the desk, gently, as if he were setting down something fragile. He said nothing. He looked through the glass, toward the Detroit skyline in the distance, and sat that way. Jolene turned back to look at him. She looked at the man the whole city feared. The man who gave orders in 2 sentences and no one dared argue. The man she had once refused to his face the first time they met because she didn't want to owe anyone. That man was sitting there, silent, in front of a handwritten letter from an old man who had been gone for 7 years. And on his face was something Jolene had never seen in all the time she had known him. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't anger. It was the quiet trembling of a person who had just discovered that he had been trusted. Not because he was strong, not because someone needed him, not because of a debt, but because someone had looked inside him and seen something worthy. Franklin hadn't written about Warren as a debtor. He had written about him as a good man, living in a world that wasn't good. And he had been right. Warren placed his hand on the letter, his fingers touching the trembling strokes of the final line. Then he looked at Jolene. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything at all. But Jolene understood, because she had seen enough in that man's eyes to know that from this moment on, everything Warren did for her was no longer about repaying Franklin. It was because he wanted to be worthy of what that old man had written about him. Warren took 1 week to prepare. He didn't rush, because he knew the best trap wasn't the fastest one, but the one the prey walked into on its own because it believed it was winning. He had his people contact Perry's side and propose an official negotiation meeting about the business territory issue between the 2 organizations. A neutral location, a rented conference room in a major hotel in downtown Detroit. Lawyers from both sides. Independent witnesses. Perry accepted at once because he believed this was a sign that Warren was in a weakened position after Garrett, after losing 2 facilities, after being harassed by the police. Perry believed Warren wanted to negotiate to cut his losses. And Perry Stanton never missed a chance to sit down at a table when he believed he was winning. That morning, Perry arrived at the hotel with his private legal team, 3 men in black suits, carrying leather briefcases, their faces confident. He stepped into the conference room, looked around, and saw Warren already seated at the head of the table, with Bert and a lawyer Perry didn't recognize. 4 independent witnesses sat at the far end of the room, 2 invited by each side. Everything looked like an ordinary business negotiation. Perry sat down, opened his briefcase, and began talking about territorial division, business boundaries, and the proposal he had prepared. He had spoken for about 5 minutes when the conference room door opened. Jolene Whitfield walked in. Perry stopped in the middle of his sentence. He looked at her, the woman he had had his men force into a chair in a warehouse less than 2 weeks earlier, the woman he thought had been frightened enough to stay quiet and disappear. She was standing there in front of him, in a conference room full of witnesses, and in her hands was a thick file. Behind Jolene, Maggie Caldwell walked in, carrying her own document case, nodded to the witnesses from both sides, then sat in the chair beside Jolene. Perry looked from Jolene to Warren. Warren didn't look back. He sat still in his usual place, both hands resting on the table, his face without expression, as if everything happening was going exactly according to a plan he had known for a long time. Because it was. Jolene stood at the head of the table across from Perry. She didn't open the file right away. She spoke first, not in legal language, not in the voice of a lawyer or a plaintiff, but in the voice of Franklin Whitfield's granddaughter. She said her grandfather was the man who had taught her how to use a shovel before she knew how to read, the man who had planted the oak tree in the backyard on the first day she came to live with him The man who had worked his whole life to build assets for his family, only to have the person he trusted most steal everything from him. She said she had lived 7 years alone after he died, not knowing the truth, not knowing what had been taken from him, until she returned to the old house and dug beneath the oak tree he had planted for her. Then she opened the file. She placed each document on the table, one by one. The original ownership contract under Franklin Whitfield's name, the transfer papers with forged signatures, the comparison between her grandfather's left-handed signature and the right-handed signatures on the transfer documents, Franklin's detailed notes about the night Perry forged the signatures, including the date, the time, the location, and the name of the man who had stood guard outside the door. Franklin Whitfield's original will naming Jolene as his sole heir. With every document Jolene placed on the table, Maggie Caldwell stood and explained its legal meaning, briefly, precisely, point by point. Maggie had waited 7 years for these documents. She knew every number, every clause, every loophole Perry had used to seize the Whitfield assets, and now she closed each one in front of Perry's lawyers, in front of the witnesses, in front of everyone. Perry's lawyers began to object, but every time they raised an argument, Maggie placed another document on the table: certified copies, bank records, transaction receipts. Each document was another door slamming shut in Perry's face, and he looked at the pile of papers growing higher and higher on the table without being able to say anything. Perry signaled to the 2 men sitting behind him. One of them began to stand. Warren stood up, just stood. Didn't say anything. Didn't look at those 2 men. He only stood in his place, silent, and everyone in the room felt the weight of that single movement. Perry's 2 men sat back down. Perry sat alone on the other side of the table. His lawyers looked at the stack of documents, then at one another. None of them said another word, because there was nothing left to say. The evidence was too clear, too complete, too detailed. Franklin Whitfield had prepared for this moment 7 years earlier, and he had prepared perfectly. The file was handed over to the independent witnesses and the authorities during that very meeting. Perry Stanton was arrested that same afternoon. When he walked out of the hotel building, both hands cuffed in front of him, there was no lawyer walking beside him, because all 3 had already left before that. There was no one to open the car door for him because his driver had been instructed not to wait. For the first time in Perry Stanton's life, he walked through a door no one had opened for him. After Perry was taken away, the conference room slowly emptied. The witnesses signed the papers and left. The lawyers gathered their files. Bert stood outside the door waiting. Inside the room, only Jolene and Maggie remained. Maggie closed her document case, stood, and looked at Jolene. She handed Jolene a set of papers, the confirmation of legal inheritance, the final document she had kept for 7 years while waiting for the right person to come and receive it. "Your grandfather would be very proud," Maggie said. Then she picked up her case, nodded, and walked out of the room. Jolene Whitfield stood in the empty conference room after Maggie left, holding the papers confirming her inheritance rights, and she looked down at her name, printed clearly on the first line: Jolene Whitfield, the sole legal heir to Franklin Whitfield's estate. She had lived 27 years owning nothing but an old pickup truck and a box of gardening tools. Now she stood here, holding in her hands the very thing her grandfather had protected with his whole life. But the first thing Jolene did after all the legal procedures were completed wasn't transfer money, wasn't buy a new house, wasn't leave Detroit to start over somewhere no one knew her. The first thing she did was drive her pickup truck back to her grandfather's old house. She stood in front of the gate, looking at the house where, the last time she had come, she had only been a hired gardener called in to clear the weeds. Now this house was hers. This land was hers. The oak tree in the backyard was hers, and she knew exactly what she was going to do with it. Jolene used part of the restored estate to repair the house from roof to foundation. She hired workers to fix the tiled roof, replace the windows, repaint the walls, and install new electrical and plumbing systems. She kept the layout of the house exactly as her grandfather had built it, changing nothing, because she didn't want to erase his traces. She restored the garden, replanted the hedges, repaired the walkway, and cared for the oak tree until the garden looked the way it had when he was still alive. Then she built more. Behind the garden, on the empty piece of land her grandfather had never had time to use, Jolene had a row of small, clean houses and a training workshop built. She turned the place into a vocational training center and temporary shelter for young people in Detroit who had nowhere to lean on. People 18, 19, 20 years old with no one, no address to call home. no door that opened when they knocked. She knew exactly what they needed because she had been them. She taught them how to plant, how to repair, how to garden, the skills her grandfather had taught her. The kind of skills that meant hands that knew how to work would never have to bow and beg from anyone. On the day the center opened, Jolene stood in the garden, watching the first group of students hold shovels and practice digging holes for planting trees. They were clumsy, digging too shallow or too deep, holding the shovel with the wrong hand. But they were doing it, and that was all that mattered. Jolene guided them in a gentle, patient voice, the same way her grandfather had once guided her. She looked toward the gate and saw Warren standing there. He didn't come inside, didn't give a speech, didn't stand in front of the crowd. He only stood at the gate, both hands in the pockets of his coat, watching Jolene teach the students how to plant trees. Jolene looked at him and gave a slight nod. Warren nodded back. Nothing more was needed, because both of them knew that simply being there was enough. That afternoon, after all the students had gone home, after Warren had driven away, after the center had grown quiet again and only the sound of wind moving through the leaves remained, Jolene walked out to the backyard. She moved slowly along the path she had relaid with new stones, past the flower beds she had replanted, toward the oak tree. The oak still stood there, large, steady, its canopy covering one corner of the garden. The place where she had dug up the metal box had been filled in. New grass had grown over it, and no trace remained. Jolene sat down beside the roots, leaned her back against the trunk, and placed her hand on the rough bark she had first touched. When she was still so small, she had to tilt her head back to see the top. She closed her eyes. The evening wind moved through the garden, carrying the smell of damp soil and new grass. The oak leaves rustled softly above her head, a sound she hadn't heard in 7 years, and now she was hearing it again as if it had never been gone. "I'm home now, Grandpa." Jolene Whitfield, the 27-year-old woman who had lived without anyone for 7 years, who had slept in her pickup truck, who had dug soil and planted trees for strangers just to get through the day, who had been betrayed, threatened, held captive, and had never once collapsed, had finally found the place where she belonged. Not because she found the estate, not because she won in court, but because she found the one thing 7 years of loneliness had never been able to take from her, the truth that she had always been loved, even when the whole world had made her believe she was alone. Sometimes in this life, the person who loves us most isn't the one who stays beside us the longest. It is the one who quietly prepares everything before leaving, hiding love in the places only we can find, so that when we are ready, everything is already there, waiting. And real gratitude never lives in words. It lives in the act of keeping a promise to someone, even when that person is no longer here to witness it. If this story touched your heart, please hit like and share it with the people who need to hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next stories, because sometimes the right story at the right moment can change the way you see life. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment and share your thoughts. We always want to listen to the things that come from deep inside your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every single day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.